Hello, entrepreneurs, and welcome to today's episode of the Daily List Report. We've got a great show for you today. We've got Adam Mendler. He is the CEO of the Veloz Group and lots of interesting businesses. He's really a leadership guru. He focuses on motivation, on leadership, strategic advisory. I got a couple things that I'm going to pull up here so you can take a look. First is his website, adammendler.com. Bunch of information here. You know, he's a prominent speaker on many famous websites, TV shows, so on and so forth. But he's got a really great podcast. So he's got a podcast right here. I've got it up. Links are below. It's called 30-Minute Mentors. And, you know, he's fortunate enough to have had conversations with a lot of really interesting people. Look at episode 46, Randy Jackson, Bill Walton, right? You know, gosh, Craig Newmark, who's the founder of Craigslist. You know, there's a lot of familiar names and faces here, which is awesome because it means that he's able to pull sort of a broad perspective across all of these topics and really distill out, I think, some amazing leadership principles. Of course, he's also on Instagram at Adam Mendler, so definitely follow him there. Again, all of these links are below, so go ahead and check that stuff out. You know, you're going to meet him in just a moment here, and I think you're going to be really excited about, you know, what he has to offer in this conversation that we're about to have. So, of course, you know, while you're here, please consider subscribing to the channel. Click that little bell so you're notified of future episodes. And without further ado, let me bring Adam on. Adam, welcome to the show.
Randy, great to be here with you. Excited to be here with you and be here with your audience.
No, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. You know, Adam, one of the things that I love to do is to give my guests just a few minutes to kind of introduce themselves, right? You run a bunch of different businesses. You know, you did your undergrad at USC. I believe you did your MBA at UCLA. So there's a conflict there, that an inherent conflict I'm curious about. But why don't you talk a little bit about your background and how you came to be?
Yeah, so Randy, firstly, I was thinking about bailing on this interview once you told me you were a Dodger fan, but
Ha!
we'll try to make the best of it. So I'm an LA native,
Wait,
but
you mean, I think you meant to say the World Championship Dodger fan. That's what you meant to say, right?
when you spend 10 years trying to buy a championship, you're ultimately going to succeed. So I grew up
Fair
in
enough.
LA, born and raised here, and did my undergrad at USC, got my MBA at UCLA. In between, I worked on Wall Street for a couple of years for what was then the largest hedge fund in the world, a company called D.E. Shaw. After my 2.5 years working for D.E. Shaw, I got my MBA. While I was in business school, I worked for Universal Pictures. I worked for William Morris Endeavor. And then I went back into the financial services industry after graduating. I worked for Credit Suisse. And when I was in my late 20s, I had all this big corporate experience under my belt and felt like if I was ever going to do something entrepreneurial, it was the right time in my life to do it. And among other reasons, I left my career and started the Veloz Group. So my brother and I joined forces. We started a company with which turned out to be the parent company for a lot of different ideas we had. And over the years, we've built 3 different businesses underneath the Veloz umbrella. One is an office furniture company called Beverly Hills Chairs. We're the leading sellers in the country of refurbished brand name office chairs. So the Herman Miller Aeron chair, for example, which is the best-selling office chair of
Yep.
all time, that retails brand new for $1,400. We sell that chair at about 50% off retail, and we're the top sellers of that refurbished. We also have a cigar company called Custom Tobacco. So if you go to customtobacco.com, you can create your own fully customized private label cigars. So for all of you real estate agents listening, anytime you're either trying to prospect or closing a deal, you can go to Custom Tobacco and design a fully customized private label cigar, premium cigars, and you can have your own fully customized cigar band. So it's a great tool for prospecting. It's a great tool for gifts, for events. And we started a software consulting and technology development business. So those are the different companies I've started in my life as an entrepreneur. As you've generously mentioned, Randy, I also do a lot of writing and speaking called 30-Minute Mentors, which was really an evolution of all this work I've done around leadership. And I'm about to hit episode number 50. Each week I go one-on-one with one of America's most successful people on how they got to the top, but more importantly, on how listeners can get to the top. And I've actually had really prominent world of residential real estate. Mauricio Omansky, the founder of the agency, was one of my guests. I have a couple more coming up in the pipeline who I'm sure your guests will know about on board for 2021. So it's a lot of fun. It keeps me busy and just love doing it.
So, that's really interesting, Adam. I mean, I think it's pretty cool, clearly, what you've done with your businesses, right? And so to be able to sort of, have a holding company or an opportunity to sort of build out different things you're passionate about is really cool. I'm particularly interested, of course, in the podcast that you're doing and some of the conversations that you've had, right? So you mentioned sort of two facets of this. One is, talking to amazing leaders about how they came to be, right? Amazing leaders and people. But two is really how to help the audience to become better leaders themselves. So, Adam, I think a good and interesting starting place for me would be, let's talk a little bit about, from your perspective, the conversations that you've had with these amazing people. What are some of the things that stand out, right? What are some of the hallmarks of a great leader?
Yeah, great question, Randy. And the truth is we could spend the entire podcast on this topic. We can spend the entire day, week, month, year on this topic. It's a big topic. But to give listeners a few, I think it's really important to understand that leadership is not about me, it's about you. It's not about the leader, it's about who the leader is leading. So to bring it back to everyone listening, my understanding is that Randy and the listeners here are deeply enmeshed in the world of residential real estate. But the truth is, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, because one of the things that I found is the core principles of effective leadership are universal. A residential real estate company, you could lead a baseball team, you could lead a Fortune 500 company, a multi-billion-dollar tech startup. To be an effective leader, you need to understand how to be an effective listener. You need to understand how to truly recognize the needs and wants of those around you, internalize them, and translate them into action. Leadership is truly about taking everyone around you, taking 1 + 1 and turning it into 3. Now, how do you do that? So there's sort of an old school philosophy, which is effective leaders lead through screaming and yelling and commanding. And what I believe very strongly, and this is reinforced by all of the great leaders who I've spoken to be an effective leader, you need to lead through motivation, not through intimidation. You need to lead by convincing and compelling others that the work that you're doing is important work. Doesn't matter what kind of work it is, it's important. You need to take the time to explain, to compel, to persuade. And you need to create a culture that will ultimately not only attract top talent, but will allow top talent to thrive and to work to the best, not only of each individual's capacity, but to work in the best possible way as a team. So, I mean, those are a few just kind of high level principles. A couple of interesting things that I could throw in there. To be a great leader, you have to be, I mentioned a great listener, but you also have to be someone who is deeply dedicated to continually learning, continually growing, continually improving. Just yesterday, someone was asking me, what is it about some of the guests who are on your podcast? And he referenced Bill Walton. What is it about some of these great leaders that allows them to stay relevant all these years later? So Bill Walton was arguably the greatest player in the history of college basketball. Goes into the the NBA, wins 2 championships. But a lot of people my age and younger don't even remember him as a basketball player. They know Bill Walton as an announcer because he spent the past 30 years broadcasting games, and not only broadcasting games, but as a singular voice broadcasting games. I mean, to me, there's no color commentator like Bill Walton. And what it really comes down to is a desire to continually grow, continually learn, and an inability to sit still and to sit stagnant. And Bill Walton is a great example of that, but just about every guest I've interviewed is a great example of that. Every person I've interviewed has told me, either on air or off air, just how important lifelong learning is to them. And that has been a great lesson to me in understanding what makes a great leader.
So, Adam, I think certainly I agree with everything that you said, right? That having this kind of growth mindset, always growing, always learning, is certainly one of the hallmarks, I think, of a great leader. There's something else I kind of want to get your thoughts on, because this has been my observation, not exclusively, but many times. One of the best books that I read over the last year was called The 9 Lies About Work. And one of the lies that they argue in there is that great leaders are well-rounded. And what they say, in fact, is that many great leaders are what they call spiky, right? They're really, really good at one thing. And if you're really, really good, if you're the best in the world at one thing, then that drives a following. And, the example that, it's a bit, pedestrian, right? But the example that I go to illustrate this is Steve Jobs, right? So Steve Jobs was clearly an amazing product visionary. By most accounts, he was a pretty horrible person otherwise, right? So people didn't follow him because he was the great philanthropist, right? Or a great father, a great husband. They followed him because he was the best in the world at creating these products. And so I'm curious, because you've talked to so many interesting people, how do you react to that? How do you think about sort of this idea of great leaders being very spiky, very narrowly focused on one thing that they are the absolute best at?
So it's an interesting example because one of my guests on 30-Minute Mentors used to work for Steve Jobs. I had Trip Hawkins on the podcast, and Trip Hawkins was the creator, the founder of Electronic Arts, the massive video game company. And Trip was one of the early employees at Apple. And we spent a good chunk of the podcast talking about Trip's early days at Apple, his time working for Steve Jobs. But a big part of Apple's success was the other leaders at Apple. And when you look at any organization that thrives, that succeeds, that wins, when you look at the Chicago Bulls, everyone immediately turns to Michael Jordan and says, Michael Jordan, leader of the Chicago Bulls. In actuality, there have been articles written. There was a great Wall Street Journal article written about the importance of Bill Cartwright's leadership and how Bill Cartwright was the true leader of the Chicago Bull championship teams. So I think it's really important to understand, when you're talking about leadership, who really is the leader of the team. Now, not to say Steve Jobs wasn't the leader of Apple, he clearly was, but being a leader isn't confined to simply being the CEO of an organization or being the captain of the team or the head coach. Anyone and everyone can be a leader. We all should have the mindset of being leaders. A question I'm often asked is, why should I care about leadership? Why does leadership matter to me? And honestly, some of your listeners might be asking this question. Why should I care about leadership? I might be a solo practitioner. I might have a small team. I might be working for a team. Why does leadership matter? And the reality is that no matter what you do, no matter who you are, no matter what role you have, you are a leader. You have the capacity to be a leader, whether you're leading in ways formal or informal. And you could be a leader of your company. You could be a leader in your company. You could be a leader in your community. You could be a leader in informal ways. You go to the grocery store and there's a skirmish breaking out and someone needs to break it up, is that going to be you? Or is there not going to be a leader to step in? So it's really important to understand that each and every one of us has to fully consume this content. But back to your question, I get really passionate about this, and it's easy to digress. But I think that with a leader like Steve Jobs, he possessed very, very integral attributes of effective leaders. So Steve Jobs was a visionary. Steve Jobs walked the walk. So much of leadership is leading by example. Again, we go back to the fact that a misconception of great leadership is yelling and screaming and telling someone what to do, but instead it's really about being the kind of leader who people can look to and say, this person lives it, breathes it, and I want to follow them. Steve Jobs did that. So we can each lead in different ways. And that's, to me, a big lesson to take from leaders like Steve Jobs, in addition to the clear importance of having a great vision, whether that vision is yours or someone else's vision, the ability to articulate a vision and lay out a vision that others can follow and execute upon is extremely important.
I think that makes a lot of sense, Adam. So, thank you for sharing that. I have kind of a follow-up question, right? So, and that is that there are people that are listening right now who, in some way, shape, or form, regard themselves as a leader. They could be a leader of a small team. They could be a leader of a brokerage, right? They could be an executive or a leader within, a much larger entity or company. And, one of the things that I think I learned personally too late in life is the value of mentorship, is the value of a mentor, right? And it was later in my career than I would like to admit that I finally sort of embraced that and found an amazing mentor, and I've continued that process since. So talk a little bit about the mentorship side of this. What role does it play as we all try to become better leaders? And how do you find a great mentor?
Really good question, Randy. Yeah, I'm a very big believer that it's impossible to enjoy any level of success without the help of others. And there are two forms of mentors. There is a traditional mentor, the kind of mentor who it sounds like you've been fortunate enough to find in your life and in your career, the kind of mentor who you might meet with on a regular basis, you might go out to lunch with once a month, or grab coffee with, or jump on a phone call. Nowadays, it could be a Zoom call. But I'm also a big believer in what I call mini mentors. And that's what I try to bring to life through 30-minute mentors. And a mini mentor could be someone that you might only talk to once, or you talk to once a year, or once every now and then. But through that interaction, you can gain so much knowledge, so much wisdom, so much value that it will make a huge difference in your life and in your career. And I've been the beneficiary of so much of that. And I really implore everyone to not only try to find a great mentor or great mentors, but to try to find great mini mentors. And there are lots of different ways to do it, but I think it starts with clearly a desire to having a mindset that I want to seek mentorship. But number two, understanding that you can't really go up to someone, or you can, but it's not going to be as effective. It's going to be hard to go up to someone and say, Randy, can you be my mentor? It's not like Mr. Rogers where you say, will you be my neighbor? It doesn't really work that way, because at the end of the day, most people who you would want to be your mentor have a lot going on in their lives. They're really busy, and gaining access to them could be challenging, let alone gaining access to them on an ongoing basis and gaining access to a deep level of commitment from them is a pretty big ask. So I'm a big believer in trying to cultivate relationships in a more organic way. What I tell people on this topic, and something I talk about all the time, whether I'm speaking to audiences, I actually teach a class at UCLA, and I was just talking about this last week with one of the students. I think it's really important to try to seek out people who you share commonalities with. So if you have just an example, I did my undergrad at USC, I got my MBA at UCLA. Those are great starting points. Start off with your alumni network. I love baseball. What about trying to find someone else who's also into baseball? That could be a great area that you could bond over. What about someone who is in a similar affinity group, similar geographical ties or connections? Try to find a commonality that you're going to be able to bond over. So that will make the ability to connect a lot more organic, a lot more natural. I tell a story, which I'll give the shorter version of, but someone reached out to me and was interested in connecting, and the story will be not as interesting because I'm going to make it shorter, but was interested in connecting and reached out in a very unnatural way on LinkedIn. I kind of, jumped on a quick call, but wasn't really that engaged because I'm busy and, sort of felt like I did my part and did a 15-minute call, and that was it. I never thought I would interact with this person again in my life. And then he followed up on that call with an email. On our call, it was all business. And then in the email, he followed up and said, "Hey, I did a little bit more research into you, and I see that you're a big Angels fan. I'm actually a huge baseball fan. I played baseball in college. If you ever have any interest in going to an Angel game, let me know." We wound up going to a game, and we became really good buddies. So this is a guy who, anytime he calls or texts me, I'll respond within 5 minutes. So find areas of commonality. That's a big one.
I think that makes a lot of sense, Adam, and that's been my experience as well, right? Whether we like it or not, we are humans and we find ways to connect, and those commonalities, whether it's, the school you went to, right, or baseball or golf or hobbies, whatever, those are the things that bring us together, I think, in really interesting ways. I really like, actually, your concept of mini mentors. And those mini mentors, like you said, you're doing through your podcast, right? Like, I don't know Reid Hoffman personally, but I think of Reid Hoffman as a mini mentor of mine, right? Masters of Scale, his podcast is, I think, absolute gold as a tech entrepreneur, right? And so I listen to that all the time. And so I love that idea of mini mentors. And so there's lots of ways to find this. So I think that's really great advice. My next question is, we sort of wrap up here, is I think, a timely one for you, Adam, which is, leadership is leadership is leadership. And I don't mean that it's generic. I mean that, it's a real important thing. And through good times and bad times, right, you are tested or otherwise. This has been an interesting year for a lot of people. But I not maybe in the way that you might think off the bat, which is that this has been an amazing year for residential real estate specifically. And so a lot of the people listening right now, many of them have had their best years ever. And so you've got this interesting sort of dichotomy between people listening who've had amazing years and people who are really struggling right now or dealing with fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And so can you talk a little bit, as we wrap up today's show, about sort of the aspects of leadership that really stand out to you through times that are as uncertain as they are right now, given the election and the pandemic and all of the things that were sources of stress for people? Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, a great question. And to me, you actually hit the nail on the head with the way you introduced the question. I think that there are really important principles that leaders need to understand when it comes to leading during times of uncertainty. But those are very similar, if not the exact same principles, that leaders need to be aware of, even in times that are stable. So the difference is that if you're not following them, in times of uncertainty, you're going to get crushed. So what are those? And this is a topic I've been talking quite a bit about. First and foremost, it's imperative that leaders are honest, truthful. And I know that this is counter because in some industries and the industry that a lot of Randy listeners of today's podcast, you guys might be feeling like, hey, I'm honest, I'm straightforward, but a lot of my competitors aren't. And I can tell you that as a leader, and if you don't want to believe me, you could believe people who are exponentially more successful than me, who are my guests on my podcast, who I probe this topic with. And when I ask on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is ethics to leadership and why? And they say 10, and here's why. And again, we can go on and on just about this topic alone. First and foremost, leaders need to be honest, truthful, ethical, straightforward.
Amen.
And really quickly, why is that the case? Because if your word is gone, if your word is shattered, then in times of uncertainty, no one's going to follow you. No one's going to believe you. When you say do this, or when you say we've got to do this, people are going to look at you and they're not going to follow you into the foxhole because they're not going to believe you. So you have to build that credibility in good times, but in times of uncertainty, that's when you cash that check. So important to be truthful, especially in times of uncertainty, because when you're lying, your lies are going to come back to bite you. Number two, it's extremely important for leaders to be highly communicative. And this is a lesson important to leaders in all industries. I learned this in the industry that I worked in before I became an entrepreneur. It's really important in your industry. And going back to the financial services industry, during the crash of 2008, what happened was the market crashed. But interestingly enough, the managers who survived the crash intact were not the managers whose portfolios performed the best. Because what happened was everyone's portfolios performed poorly. The managers who performed the best, the managers who survived were the managers who were most communicative. They were the managers who were not pretending like nothing bad was happening. They weren't hiding under the covers. They weren't ducking and running. They were communicating with their clients, explaining exactly what was going on, delivering bad news, and not afraid to deliver it. That is extremely important. And point number three, just because I know we're running up on time, because we can keep going, but the ability, the willingness, the mindset where it's deeply ingrained in you to adapt to the winds of change. Change is inevitable. And the only certainty in business is uncertainty. So as a leader, you need to have a mindset that is fully prepared for the winds of change. And you need to build an organization that is nimble and prepared to adapt to whatever changes are coming, even if they're changes, and particularly given that they are going to be changes that you can't anticipate.
Well said, Adam. What's interesting is that our values stack at ListReports in this order is ethics, culture, performance. So I totally agree with you that ethics has to be on top, right? That is absolutely number one, For us, culture is number 2, performance is number 3, because it's really a byproduct of that if you're hiring really, really good people. So I think that's great. I didn't have as much time as I wanted to listen to a lot of your episodes, Adam, but I'm very excited to dive in. You've got some great guests. I'm particularly interested in your conversation with Craig Newmark, just because for those of you out there, I'm sure all of you know what Craigslist is, and some of you are probably like, how come it still looks like a website from 1994? Well, that's sort of by design, right? And it's a very profitable business, but, could have made many, many billions of dollars many times over by selling that business, but he hasn't. So I'm very curious about what he had to say. So anyways, Adam.
He dives into that. Randy, not apologies for
no, please.
interjecting, but we discussed that. That's a big topic of the podcast. And Craig shares his reasoning as to why Craigslist has been operated in such an untraditional way, why he rejected venture funding, why he went against the grain. Really interesting stuff.
That's amazing. There's not that many examples of that anymore, right? There's Craigslist. I'd put Matt Drudge and the Drudge Report on that, right? Like there's a handful of these examples, which is pretty fascinating stuff. Anyways, Adam, hey, thanks for taking time to do this today. I'd love to have you back on. I think we can dive into, like you said, we could talk for hours about this stuff, and we barely scratched the surface, but I think we covered some really important points.
Hopefully by the next time I'm on, the Angels will be doing a little bit better. So.
It's doubtful, but you can always hope.
If we can get some pitching, that's what we need.
That's right. Well, let's get through this craziness, and then I'll get us some seats at a Freeway Series, and then we'll duke it out head to head. How does that sound?
I'm never going to turn that down.
That's right. Absolutely. Awesome. All right, Adam, why don't you say goodbye to all of our agentpreneurs out there for today?
Hey, thank you guys. Thanks for tuning in. If anyone wants to connect, I try to make it as easy as possible. It's just my name, so you can find me at adammendler.com. You can find me on social media at Adam Mendler. My podcast, 30-Minute Mentors, is exactly as it sounds. It's all spelled out, 30-Minute Mentors on your favorite podcasting app or at 30minutementors.com.
Well said. Awesome. All right, Adam. Until next time, we'll see you soon. All right. Well, there you have it. Thanks for joining the show today. I think a lot of really great advice there. As Adam mentioned at the end, all the links are below in the description, so check them out. That podcast is amazing guests on there, right? So it's on, as he said, your favorite podcast platform, Google Play, Apple Podcasts, so on and so forth, Spotify. So go ahead and check that out. Again, 30-Minute Mentors. I think there's a lot of great stuff here. This has been a really interesting and a challenging year. And as I mentioned, a lot of you out there have had your best year financially ever, which is a strange thing to say given everything else that has been going on and a lot of the people who have been affected by the pandemic and everything that's happening this year. And so there hasn't been, in my opinion, a better time to exert and show leadership. And I think there are ways that all of you out there as real estate agents and brokers can exhibit leadership amongst your own sphere, right? They don't have to, this doesn't just apply to your employees. This can apply to people that are in your sphere of influence and people that you talk to, past customers, etc. There are micro opportunities in the same way that there are sort of micro mentor opportunities. I think there's micro leadership opportunities. And I think arguably you're in a great position to do that. So that's it for today. Again, while you're here, don't forget to subscribe and click that cool little bell so you're notified of all the future episodes that we have. And until tomorrow, be safe, be healthy, be happy, show some leadership.